Good evening. Welcome to Week 4, Part 1 of History 4890, Cold War America. When we ended off last time, we had addressed both American and Soviet perspectives concerning the origins of the Cold War. What we need to do now is to start shifting our attention to understanding more dynamics of what challenges were facing Europe and the world at the end of World War II, and how the Americans and the Soviets started becoming major power players in redefining international politics. Perhaps the greatest tragedy and challenge that occurred at the end of the World War II were the results of the Manhattan Project, which had been the American development of the atomic bomb. When Robert Oppenheimer, who was a close friend of Albert Einstein, agreed to head the Manhattan Project to develop the first atomic bombs, he did it with a certain number of conditions. Number one, there was a great concern that if the United States did not develop such a bomb, that the Germans might develop an atomic bomb as well. What Oppenheimer was inclined to do, following the lead of Roosevelt, was to create a weapon of such magnitude that all future wars would be abolished. Roosevelt, for the fact that he believed in continuing on his alliance with the Soviet Union after World War II, and making sure that this was the war to end all wars. As Roosevelt had agreed with Robert Oppenheimer that once the war was over, the atomic energy would be put in international hands, and the United States would not develop any further nuclear weapons. Robert Oppenheimer, once Truman decided not to allow this information to be held internationally, objected to the idea of using the atomic bomb as a diplomatic threat against the Soviet Union. Furthermore, when Truman started asking for the development of a hydrogen bomb, which had 1,000 times the destructive capacity of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Robert Oppenheimer once again disagreed, arguing that such a move could trigger a nuclear arms race that hypothetically could threaten the entire world. For the fact that fear and paranoia about the Soviet Union had already gripped American society, Robert Oppenheimer was denounced as being a communist by people claiming that he showed sympathy to the Soviet Union. At this time, he was stripped of all his national credentials, removed from his post at the Atomic Energy Commission, and more, the optimism that Robert Oppenheimer had when it came down to peace after World War II started to fall victim to international power politics. What we also need to do is identify very different perspectives about if justice was served at the end of the World War II when it came down to Nazi war criminals. Despite the fact that Roosevelt had agreed with Joseph Stalin that war criminals would be tracked down throughout the world and would be held accountable for their crimes. The war trials that are going to be put on, referred to as the Nuremberg Trials, are going to set a very different example. At this time, most European powers pushed for the execution not just of major Nazi leaders, but of heads of the Gestapo and other people who had been culpable in crimes against humanity. The United States, on the other hand, is going to push for the idea of having a full legal trial, in particular, embracing the idea of totalitarianism, that if Hitler made people do things, and the Nazi leadership had been culpable in that everyone outside of the top Nazi leaders were not guilty, and therefore if you simply removed the top leadership of Nazi Germany, that denazification could be completed, and that Germany was now somehow rehabilitated. What's important to understand is at this time, IBM, who had been one of the most powerful corporations in the world, assisting Hitler in organizing the Holocaust, sided with the prosecution and assisted in the process of information gathering and also in developing a top-of-the-line technology for immediate translation, since France, France, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union were all for jointly conducting these trials. The crimes that these leaders were put on trial for were, number one, conspiracy to wage war. This is evaluating their pre-war activities to argue that they had broken international law by trying to start a war. Number two, waging aggressive war. This is being found guilty for actually starting the war because according to treaties signed in 1927, war had been declared illegal. Number three, being put on trial for war crimes. This was particularly addressing crimes that had occurred against civilians, intimidation against civilians, and the utilization of forced labor to keep production going for the Nazi war machine. And the fourth one, and the most important, because it set a new precedent for international relations, was the creation of a new criminal category called crimes against humanity. This was to be holding people responsible for the genocide that occurred, particularly the Holocaust on the Eastern Front. At the end of the day, 24 top Nazi leaders are going to be put on trial. Of these 24, 3 are acquitted of all charges, 8 are going to receive prison sentences, most of them released early, and 13 are going to be executed. The reason why this is important is the very final time that Joseph Stalin met President Truman. On the final evening of the Yalta Conference, Stalin had proposed a toast stating, "I look forward to executing 500,000 Nazi war criminals with you once this war is over." And Roosevelt had toasted back, "Perhaps we can settle on 50,000. And when only 13 were executed, the Soviets asked the question, and many other Europeans asked the question, had justice been served? Perhaps the most controversial aspect of things that occurred were a subset of the Nuremberg trials, oftentimes referred to as the corporate trials. For the fact that the Soviets knew very little about how international business was conducted and international law when it came to financing, Soviet prosecutors stepped aside and allowed the Americans to take over the corporate trials, since American lawyers understood international business far better than the Soviets. If we look at the main corporations that were involved in the corporate trials, we once again have some questions. Was justice served? IG Farben, the largest chemical corporation in all of Germany, had been responsible for developing Zyklon B gas that was utilized in the gas chambers for the Holocaust. In addition, Edsel Ford, son of Henry Ford, was on the board of directors for IG Farben, and IG Farben held a huge number of shares in the American Ford Corporation. At the end of the day, 24 leaders from IG Farben are going to be put on trial. What the prosecution did was they struck a deal with IG Farben, stating that if Farben handed over to the Americans all of their patents for scientific development, since they are one of the top chemical researchers in the entire world, that the prosecution would go lenient. Of these 24 who were put on trial, 10 were completely acquitted of all charges, and 14 of them received 2 to 8 years in prison. These were the people responsible personally for the development of a gas that killed close to 3 million people during the Holocaust. Tyson Industries, who had been in charge of much of the steel production for Germany, is also a unique case. Fritz Tyson had been the main financial supporter of the Nazi Party in the early 1920s. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, it is because Fritz Tyson had a meeting with President Hindenburg recommending that Hindenburg put Hitler in power. What we also need to understand is Fritz Tyson had a ton of international connections that were absolutely vital for Germany when it came to international trade. One of his most important co-workers was a man by the name of Prescott Bush, who was CEO of an American banking group and who was the main person in charge of funneling money back and forth between the United States and Nazi Germany. For the fact that Tyson had a fallout with Adolf Hitler at the very beginning of World War II and had denounced the war and wrote a book called I Paid Hitler, where he apologized to the world for the war. He was arrested by the Allies, put on trial, but completely acquitted of all charges and allowed to move to Argentina, where he lived out the rest of his life. Krupp Industries, which had been the main supplier of German armaments during both World War I and World War II, and who had also been the worst culprit when it came to utilizing slave labor from the concentration camps throughout the war. Krupp Industries had 12 people put on trial, 1 completely acquitted, 11 receiving 2 to 12 years in prison. Alfred Krupp, who had been in charge of Krupp Industries, was told as his punishment that he could no longer be in charge of his company and that he was forced then to sell all of his assets in Krupp Industries, which was the largest corporation in all of Germany. Typically in scenarios like this, people are not forced to sell their assets, they have their assets seized. Alfred Krupp was sentenced to 12 years in prison and was released after 3 years. When he came out of prison, he came out as the wealthiest man in all of West Germany. In 1999, Tyson and Krupp Industries merged together into ThyssenKrupp AG, and they are still currently the largest steel producer in the entire world. Ford and General Motors, despite the fact that they had been the main powers starting to fuel the armaments industry in Germany during the 1930s, and had continued building for Adolf Hitler up until Pearl Harbor, where they cut off relations with their European subsidiaries and claimed they built exclusively for the Allies. At the end of World War II, not only were neither of these automakers held culpable for any of their potential actions of criminality or what some could say treason during the war, but they came out as the largest automakers in all of Europe because all of their competition had been bombed to the ground. At the end of the day, when the Soviets realized that the top leaders of German industry were literally getting away with murder, they thought this was intentional on behalf of the Americans. The American argument at the time was that Germany had been punished too harshly after World War I, and unless Germany was allowed to get back up on her feet and to normalize things as soon as possible, that World War III potentially could be right around the corner. Comparing Western Europe to Eastern Europe at the end of World War II. Western Europe had been inflicted with a huge amount of damage during World War II. In terms of West European agriculture, 50% had been destroyed. In terms of West European industry, 30% had been destroyed. One of the greatest dangers when it came to the agricultural sector is that since most of the campaigns in Western Europe had involved bombing campaigns and not actual troop combat, is oftentimes in wars that rely heavily upon bombardment, those bombs do not always explode. Still to this day, there is a team in France that works 5 days a week trying to clear out bombs in the French countryside from World War I and World War II. And they approximate that their project will finally be completed in 450 years. Still to this day, farmers in France die almost every month from bombs that explode when they're out tilling the fields. For the fact that so many people had been displaced at the end of the war or made homeless because of Allied bombing campaigns, the United Nations set up the Relief and Rehabilitation Administration to try to get people, well, at least give people homes. The greatest problem and challenge, particularly for those who had been liberated from the concentration camps, is since Allied bombardment had focused so heavily on civilian areas in Western Europe. In many areas, the only structures that were left standing were the concentration camps. For many Jews who had survived the Holocaust, their worst nightmare came true in the fall of 1945. Since there were no homes to put these Jews in, United Nations relief workers took the concentration camps and restructured them and tried to force Jews to go back to these camps that were now being run by the United Nations so they could have some type of shelter for the upcoming winter. It's at this point that Jews, if they had any ability at all, or any contacts at all, fled the European continent and attempted to resettle in the Middle East to establish a new nation called Israel. The other thing to understand is the political culture that existed in West Europe at the end of the war, particularly when it came down to West European perceptions of communists. For the fact that this war had gone on in their backyard, and that different national communist parties throughout Europe had been the main ones organizing resistance movements against Nazi occupation and exposing collaborators, communists in Western Europe were very popular. People did not perceive of them as an evil or as a threat. They considered these people heroes who oftentimes had helped to save the lives and the nations of many West Europeans. What Americans did not understand is that while domestic communists were quite popular in Western Europe, is that West Europeans did not have any affinity to the idea of Soviet power being forced upon them. There is a huge difference between being a member of the French Communist Party and being a member of the Soviet government or the Soviet Red Army. They're very different international institutions, and French communists were not threatening to import Soviet power into France. What we'll see more and more is West Europeans starting to look to having strong ties to the United States, hoping that since America was at the peak of its industrial and economic power, that the United States could assist in reconstructing and creating a better future for Western Europe. The greatest challenge then after World War II is what to do about Germany. One of the great problems of policies of denazification is there's very important arguments that since the Germans had been punished too hardly after World War I, that we needed to be a little bit more lenient when it came to the end of World War II. For the fact that Americans never experienced any attacks from Germany, we had a very different perception of the nature of the Nazi regime. For the fact that Europeans experienced genocide in their backyard, they had a very different impression of the Nazis. One of the most defining characteristics of the Nazi movement that is oftentimes forgotten when it comes to Western histories is not their emphasis upon anti-Semitism and the persecution of Jews. It is that they rose up to power in Germany as an anti-communist movement, and that the Nazis were the top anti-communists in the entire world. What we'll see is many American policymakers willing to let bygones be bygones and to collaborate with many former Nazis, now perceiving that the Soviet Union was the greatest threat to freedom and to peace. For the fact that Germany was divided up into 4 different regions of occupation caused a number of problems. The Soviets had one area of occupation in the east, and the French, the British, and the Americans all had zones of occupation in the west. What Americans hoped to do in western areas was to breed new democratic and liberal values in their zones of occupation to offset the fact that an entire generation of youth had been brought up since 1933 knowing only Nazi and fascist values. For the fact that Germany was the epicenter of the Cold War, with East and West being the dividing lines, very quickly, Cold War concerns offset concerns about justice when it came to the Holocaust. And for the fact that when the nation of Israel was born in 1947 and it needed dire economic assistance, many German politicians saw this as an opportunity that by funding the early days of the nation of Israel, that they could deflect any further criminal persecution for genocide. At the end of the war, Germany was completely destroyed, both in domestic areas and industrial production, and was under a complete economic and political collapse. What was also important is for the fact that Germans were participating in a process of colonization with eastward expansion into Poland and the Soviet Union, as many Germans during the war had resettled to the east and were now driven out of these territories that they had assumed they would be colonizing if Germany were successful after World War II. Austria is a very strange phenomenon. One factor we need to remember is that Adolf Hitler was not from Germany. He was Austrian. What's also important to remember is for the fact that the Austrian onslaught had happened in 1938, and that Germany had marched troops into Austria, declaring it now to be part of the Third Reich. As many Austrians claimed that they had not been supporters of Hitler, that they had been resistors of Hitler, and had also been victims of Nazi persecution. What was created more and more in the early days after World War II were a number of national myths concerning resistance movements. What the Allies agreed upon at the end of the war was, number one, that for a period of 5 years, Austria would be under military occupation. Number two, that Austria and Germany could never be reunited in any type of military, economic, or political alliance. Number three, for the fact that it was just the top leaders of Germany being blamed for the Holocaust. Is Austria wasn't held accountable for the Holocaust at all. Any legacies involved in the Holocaust were blamed exclusively upon Hitler and upon Germany. What was created in Austria in this scenario was a coalition government between the Austrian Social Democratic Party and the Austrian Christian Democratic Party to try and create a nation based upon liberal principles and upon ideas of social democracy. For the fact that most industry involved in the war had been in Germany, Austria was not as badly damaged as Germany. What the Allies will do is they will force Austria throughout the Cold War to remain a neutral nation, and for the most part, Austria is going to have a smooth transition after World War II. Italy faced some other problems. For the fact that fascism had been in power in Italy since the year 1923. It meant, on the one hand, many Italians had known nothing else but fascism their entire adult lives. Number two, since fascism had taken hold in Italy at such an early period, communists and socialists in Italy had put their differences aside a long time prior to this to organize resistance militias against the fascist government prior to World War II and against the fascist government throughout World War II. For the fact that the communists and socialists held so much power in different localities, it was the occupation of Italy by Western allies that many perceived had prevented any communists or socialists from potentially taking over. In June of 1946, King Emmanuel, who had been an active collaborator with the fascist powers for 2 decades, abdicated from the throne, and Italy was declared to be a republic. In order to offset any influence from the communists or the socialists, the Christian Democratic Party in Italy quickly became the only political party that Western powers would fully support. In particular, we'll see with the Marshall Plan, was that Western powers argued that if you wanted American money to reconstruct your nation, that you had to isolate the political left. In particular, if any communists were democratically elected into your government, you had to throw them out of office. For the fact that Italy was in such a state of absolute decay and the Italian economy had been isolated from the international world for so long, Italian people were willing to accept these new rules with very little resistance. Luckily, much of the industrial capacity in the northern regions of Italy were left undamaged, which helped to facilitate Italian restoration. One of the first things we need to understand about the European nation of Switzerland is Switzerland is almost completely impossible geographically to invade. Pretty much the entirety of the nation of Switzerland is mountains. In particular, the Swiss Alps are almost impossible for troops to march through. What this means is throughout its history, Switzerland has always held a unique role that in any European conflict, Switzerland has always been neutral. For the fact that Switzerland remained neutral, and for the fact that Switzerland has very strict laws when it comes to their bank accounts, making Swiss bank accounts essentially untouchable and unregulated by the international community, as Switzerland is going to become the key to hiding Nazi assets. For Nazi war criminals who fled the European continent, if they had established a Swiss bank account during the war, they were able to create new identities in different nations, particularly in South America, and to utilize access to these Swiss bank accounts to keep them protected and in safety. Still to this day, Switzerland still has many stolen assets, still to this day, and there are still lawsuits pending of people trying to get their wealth back that had been stolen from them by the Germans and held away in Swiss vaults. In particular, gold teeth, or gold fillings that had been ripped from the mouths of Jews in the concentration camps, had been saved and held in Swiss bank vaults. And still to this day, yes, the Nazi war criminals living off from gold teeth protected in Switzerland. For the fact that Switzerland had been neutral throughout the war, Switzerland is also going to be the key nation facilitating Nazi war criminals escaping persecution and immigrating to West. Throughout the Cold War, Switzerland is going to refuse to join the United Nations, and that way Switzerland could never be held accountable for anything when it came to international law. And throughout the Cold War, Switzerland remains a neutral nation. For the fact that Switzerland had not been an area that had been bombed or invaded throughout World War II, and for the fact that as Nazis looted Europe, they hid all of their money away in Swiss vaults, as Switzerland came out of World War II incredibly wealthy. What's strange with Switzerland, though, is while it's still to this day an incredibly economically advanced nation, politically, it is a strange, bizarre place. Switzerland has many political policies that are incredibly anti-immigrant, they're oftentimes associated with policies that we'd term to be fascist. In particular, in the year 1990, Switzerland was finally the last European nation to give women the right to vote. And while it is a beautiful, beautiful country, it is also a very strange place. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg collectively are going to start creating a new model for European integration. The great problem for these three nations is that while prior to World War II, they still had colonial possessions throughout the world and had empires, none of these nations were able to defend their empires during World War II. For the fact that they had lost possession of most of their colonies, they needed a new economic model to advance their own national economies. What these three nations did under the acronym Benelux is they started integrating their economies and started focusing more on their role in Europe instead of the larger world. In 1944, while still under occupation, there was a loose integration created when it came to sharing of economic resources. After World War II, these three powers are going to come together to interlink their transportation system, start sharing their coal and steel industries, and opening up free trade and removing any external tariffs between their three nations. In January of 1948, these three nations created a full-fledged economic union, where they all used the same currency, all had the same labor standards, and integrated all of their industrial resources. What this did was laid the basis for the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, which will later be the basis for the creation of the European Union. What the Benelux nations had to deal with, and part of the reason why they're willing to cooperate so much, was that many of their farmlands had been decimated and their housing structures incredibly damaged. For the fact their empires had also fallen apart to this time, we'll see Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg very quickly rising up together collectively as major powers within Europe. The Scandinavian nations of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland are going to try a different approach. What many people referred to throughout the Cold War as the third way. Or, in other words, what we call creating social democratic nations. What these four nations pursued upon was allowing socialists to become the dominant force in their post-war politics, not with a radical revolutionary agenda, but of trying to find a balance between public sector and private sector, creating a partnership to find a balance between the extremes of American-style capitalism and the extremes of Soviet-style communism. Norway and Denmark are going to focus most of their attention to the West. Both of these nations will become active members of the NATO military alliance, but they also pursue a very different independent route when it comes to their own domestic politics and economics. Sweden and Finland decided to stay neutral. One of the main reasons being is throughout Russian history, both Sweden and Finland have been major areas of tension for the Russians, oftentimes both areas falling under Russian occupation and being part of the Russian Empire. For the fact that Sweden and Finland remained neutral throughout the Cold War, as they are key players in facilitating negotiations between American leaders and Soviet leaders when both sides would refuse to cooperate. One of the main reasons why Norway looked to a closer alliance with the West is Norway had been hit hardest by the war. It was the first nation occupied by Nazi Germany and been one of the initial battlegrounds of World War II. What we'll see here is the creation of a very vibrant balance between public jobs, a social welfare state, and private investment, where private corporations are heavily regulated and having to deal with extremely high taxes, but also where there are enough things created within the public sector to finance social welfare programs and to create, in many ways, a brand new economic model for other socialist movements. To give an example of that, the first time I met somebody from Sweden, they came to Central Michigan University when I was an undergraduate to give a talk on international politics. It was this individual's first trip outside of the Scandinavian nations, in particular their first trip to the United States. Halfway through that trip, that academic said that he never planned on coming back to the United States, because when he flew into Detroit, Michigan, he saw homeless people for the very first time. He said, having lived in Sweden his entire life, he had never seen a homeless person, because they don't exist in Sweden. And Swedish corporations such as IKEA, while the founder of IKEA is one of the wealthiest men in the world, he also chooses to continue staying on living in Sweden, where he pays at an 80% tax rate. But what he says is he said even paying 80% of his wealth in taxes, as he lives in a nation where he never has to fear of crime, he doesn't have to worry about social instability, and he doesn't have to see poverty and homelessness. And for him, that's worth the price of living in a place like Sweden. Spain is going to present a very interesting challenge. One of the things that we need to remember about Spain is that the Mediterranean, particularly after the creation of the Suez Canal, is the most important strategic area in the entire world. Because whoever controls the Mediterranean controls access to the Suez Canal. And whoever controls access to the Suez Canal controls the trade routes of Europeans that want to trade with Asia, and also access to the oil supplies of the Middle East. Which means in the 20th century, whoever is in charge of Spain, potentially with the Straits of Gibraltar, could control access to the world's most important natural resources. Despite the fact that Spain had come under the rule of a fascist dictator in 1939, Francisco Franco decided to stay neutral during World War II, in particular for the fact that he was in debt highly to many Western corporations such as Ford, General Motors, and Standard Oil. Franco argued that he did not have the funds to fight or to participate in World War II. What's important to understand, though, is that while Spain was not officially an active part of this war, Spanish volunteers, who were fascists, volunteered to assist German forces on the Eastern Front when it came to their fight against the Soviet Union, and also in the Holocaust. During the 1930s, during the Spanish Civil War, Spain became a nation incredibly divided and incredibly isolated. And what we'll see is that Spain is the key to accessing and controlling the Mediterranean, and for the fact that the Middle East was still part of the British Empire at this point. As Western leaders are going to stop referring to Franco as a fascist and start referring to him almost immediately as an anti-communist ally. And Francisco Franco is going to continue on with this fascist-style military dictatorship in Spain all the way until the mid-1970s, when he finally dies. What's also important to understand is that Franco had created concentration camps in 1939 to persecute those who had fought for the Spanish Republic in the 1930s. And for the fact that Spain was never liberated from fascism, those concentration camps were not shut down until the death of Franco in the 1970s. One of my old roommates, when I lived in Scotland, Pablo, was from Spain. And he told me the story about how his grandfather was arrested in 1939 by the Franco regime, put into a concentration camp, and held there until 1973. And still to this day, many people in Spain, very rarely do people bring up or talk about the Spanish Civil War, because Spain is still feeling the political impact of those years. But the fact that Spain was economically backwards and politically isolated, the Cold War allowed Spain, under fascist rule, to re-emerge as a power solidly allied with the West and gaining American economic and military aid under the guise of anti-communism. Greece, for the fact that Greece is a key player in the politics of the Mediterranean. Winston Churchill had negotiated with Joseph Stalin in 1944 that Greece would be part of the British sphere of influence once the war was over, to assist Great Britain in maintaining its control of its empire in the Middle East. What occurred was, throughout Nazi occupation, the Greek Communist Party had been very active in organizing the partisans and the resistance movements. And when it looked like Britain was going to impose, that Britain was going to help to impose a dictatorship in Greece after World War II, Greek communists started to resist. What Joseph Stalin did at the time was he denounced most of the leaders of the Greek Communist Party and refused to aid them in their fight against British troops. Yugoslavia, which had just become communist under the leadership of Marshal Tito, offered to assist those Greek communists in their armed struggle against the British. What Tito started doing at this point was offering what many called a new anti-Moscow paradigm, arguing that Joseph Stalin had ceased to represent the international communist movement, that he could not be trusted, and that communists should not ally themselves to Joseph Stalin because his only interest was in Soviet national security, not in the interests of communist parties throughout the world. What is going to assist the British in crushing things out in Spain is, number one, with the passing of the Truman Doctrine in 1947, Harry S. Truman is going to fund the British war against Greek forces. Number two, Marshall aid, which is going to start flowing in by the millions into Greece, are going to help to marginalize the communist movement in the hopes that normality will soon come to Greece. And even though many Greeks were calling for the creation of a republic, the former Greek monarchy is restored to power at the end of World War II. In the mid-1960s, when there started being threats of uprisings in Greece, of people wanting to get rid of the monarchy and to establish a democratic republic, the Greek military overthrew the monarchy and established a military dictatorship in that nation from 1965 to 1974 with full support of its NATO allies. Still to this day, very similar to the Spanish Civil War, there are huge divisions within Greece, left over from the period of civil war that broke out at the end of World War II. more and more Greek leaders are going to look to the West and look to NATO, hoping for assistance, in particular for the fact that Greece is an incredibly strategic location against the Soviet Union. Number one, in potentially blocking any Soviet naval ships from coming out of the Black Sea, but also number two, is a place to install nuclear missiles that have the ability to bomb Moscow. As we'll see, even though Greece is primarily a dictatorship during much of the Cold War, they're considered an ally because of their strategic potential. At the end of World War II, there are many different ideas that came up about the idea of European unity, many arguing that different national competitions are what had plagued Europe and driven Europeans into two different world wars in one century. What we need to understand about the concept of internationalism at this time is that internationalism is neither a concept of the far left or of the far right, as there are three different competing models on how to unite Europe into one political and economic union. The capitalist and liberal internationalism, promoted primarily by the United States, argued that if you broke down trade barriers and started increasing free market principles, that number one, this would help to increase production and prosperity, but number two, that if you had the free flow of consumer goods and of labor, that this would create a scenario where European nations no longer competed for economic dominance, but where instead they cooperated in economic union, and that this would lead to a new era of peace. Socialist internationalism had a bit of a different concept. Number one, they argued that it wasn't just nationalism in Europe that had been a barrier to peace, but that capitalism itself was the biggest obstacle to peace. What socialists identified was that due to the bust and boom cycles oftentimes associated with capitalism, is that when markets began to collapse, is that what that traditionally led to was European nations pulling back on free trade agreements, becoming isolationist in their economies, and then becoming expansionistic to try and trigger economic development. What they argued is that if you created unity on socialist principles, where governments became the main financiers and owners of industry instead of private investors, that this would get rid of the bust and boom cycles associated with capitalism and would help to save future peace. They also argued that if you had universal labor and social welfare policies throughout European nations, standardized, that it would stop workers from flowing around all the time, it would stop employers from trying to compete to steal each other's labor resources, and would create an era of peace. As Leon Trotsky had always argued prior to his assassination, was the idea of creating what many socialists called a United States of Europe. What we also need to understand is that while fascism is associated with concepts of ultranationalism, that the fascists in many ways had an internationalist vision as well. What they were interested in was the idea of uniting Europeans in some type of common cause. And what the fascists did was they looked back to the principles first established in the year 1095 by the Pope and the launching of crusades. The Pope had initially created the crusades to try and offset that Europeans were incredibly divided after the fall and decline of the Roman Empire. The Pope believing at the time that Christianity and a common mission Well, that the Crusades would unite Europeans in a common cause. What the fascists argued was that the new common cause for Europeans was to unite in threats against communism. What they argued was that communism was a philosophy that came from Eastern Europe and that came from Asia, that was associated with atheism or Judaism, and that it was a threat to Christian civilization. What fascists had hoped in many ways was to preserve the power structures of old Europe in the modern world through imperial domination of outside nations, a strict sense of racial hierarchy, and a common purpose and common cause of uniting against the Soviet Union. Outside of different concepts of internationalism, we need to understand some of the aspects of the Cold War that motivated Europeans into the idea of uniting. Number one, many Europeans feared the idea of Germany ever becoming a major industrial power again. What many Europeans had proposed throughout World War II was that after the war, Germany not only would not be allowed a military, but that Germany would not be allowed industry, and that Germany would essentially be a huge farmland that was demilitarized in the center of Europe. What they believed was that by having a Germany that was integrated into other nations, that would remove economic imperial competition, they would internationalize resources, and that future wars could be prevented. What helped to facilitate many early days of the idea of European unity was the fact that so many exile politicians, when they had fled the European continent during World War II, as they had lived in London in exile, working with each other, talking with each other, and helping to coordinate the liberation of Europe. And in many ways, this cooperation that had been facilitated by the war helped to breed many ideas of continuing to be unified after the war. The other thing to understand is that while both the Soviets and the Americans were acknowledged for their decisive role in liberating Europe from Nazi tyranny, Europeans on both sides in the divide of the Cold War resented being manipulated by these outside forces. What we need to understand is prior to World War II, European nations were still huge imperial powers, and they loathed the idea of either the Americans or the Russians dictating international politics to them. Number two, they also argued that the Cold War was an unnecessary phenomenon that had been bred not based upon reality, but upon perception. The other thing to understand is the Marshall Plan that was offered by the United States and the process of Stalinization, where the Soviet Union began funding the reconstruction of Eastern Europe, that integrating East European economies as one and West European economies as one helped to breed a vision for many Europeans that at some point all of Europe would unite. And that unlike the period of the Great Depression when Europeans retreated in ultranationalist modes and started competing for economic power, that now in this period Europeans would unite. Charles de Gaulle once said that his vision of Europe was one that would extend from the English Channel all the way to the Ural Mountains. Charles de Gaulle hoping that at some point, if Europe continued to expand, particularly into Eastern Europe, that not only would West and East become united, but that the Soviet Union would also play a role as a member of the European Union. What we'll see more and more then is throughout the 1940s and the early 1950s, Europeans looking at the idea of unity and creating a United States of Europe to try and offset manipulation by both the Americans and the Soviets when it came to Cold War tensions.